Hi everybody and welcome back to Murder at Bedtime. This is a no frills, no waffle true crime bedtime story. If you're a regular listener, you know by now I think you're all awesome. And if this is your first time here, I hope I can persuade you to stay. And with that, let's crack on to this evening's story, Murder in the Chicken Run. Norman Thorne trudged wearily down the dark country road, head down, shoulders hunched, back to where he now called home. A little wooden hut on the chicken farm he now owned in Crowborough, Sussex. He had just met the new love of his life, local seamstress Bessie Caldicott, and her mother off the train at the local station, after they had been on a shopping trip together, and escorted them home safely to their home in the village. And as he now made his way back, he should have been happy, a skip in his step, a smile on his face. But no, what he had failed to tell Bessie was that back at his hut waiting for him was the former love of his life and ex-fiancé, Elsie Cameron. She had turned up unexpectedly with her suitcase, refusing to believe that she had been replaced by another, especially as she was pregnant with his child and expecting him to make good his promise to marry her. The suitcase she had brought with her was to show Norman she was not leaving until he did. As he approached the door of the 12-foot by 7-foot hut, the one light glowing dimly through the window, he took a deep breath before he entered, knowing that the arguments that had got steadily worse throughout the afternoon, culminating in Elsie actually offering him sex, something she had denied him for 4 years, when Norman told her he was meeting his new love from the train. But the truth was, Norman no longer found Elsie attractive, and hadn't for quite some time. Her constant mood swings had worn him out, and her obsession with their marriage, even though they had no money. Her unemployable because of her nerves, and him working all the hours God sent and making just enough to live on. And now her insistence that she was pregnant, even though he was absolutely sure, quote, he had never put it in her. But she was quite adamant that she was pregnant due to heavy petting. Norman had no idea if this was possible, but he thought with the sort of petting that they had indulged in, it was very doubtful. He must remember to ask his father about it. He slowly opened the door and stepped in. What he saw left him frozen to the spot as he gazed upon Elsie in just her underwear, her hair down, hanging by the rope used as his washing line from the wooden ceiling beam. As soon as he could get his legs to work, he grabbed a knife, climbed onto the chair and cut her down. She fell to the floor and he could see straight away that she was dead. Norman picked her up and laid her on the bed. Then he turned out the light and laid on the table. For an hour he laid there in almost darkness, just the glow of the fire lighting the room, deciding what he should do. Eventually he realised that he would have to go and summon a doctor or the police. But then he had a much better idea. He gently picked up Elsie and laid her down by the fire. Then he stood up, went to find his hacksaw, knelt down by the woman he once loved, and by the light of the fire started to saw off Elsie's head. 18-year-old Norman Thorne has been described as slow-witted. He met Elsie Cameron, 6 years his senior, at a Wesleyan church in North London in 1920, where Norman was a Sunday school teacher. During the week, Norman worked as an electrical engineer for Fiat Motors in Wembley, and Elsie was a typist. She suffered terribly with anxiety. She found it hard to make friends, always thinking people were talking about her behind her back, and had terrible mood swings. She had decided that she had to get married. Her brother and sister were getting married soon, and she would not be left on the shelf, and she set her sights on Norman. Yes, she would have to ignore the whispering about their age difference, but she must be married. The 18-year-old Norman, with little or no experience of the opposite sex, must have been flattered by the attention of Elsie, and finally they were courting and walking out together. Those were the days I remember well myself, walking out with ladies. Anyway, enough about me and my romanticism. Things must have been going well for the couple. That is until the summer of 1921, when Norman was laid off from his job. Unable to find another, for some reason he thought it would be a good idea to borrow £100 off his father, around £4,500 in this day and age, to buy a strip of land in Crowborough in Sussex, around 50 miles from London, and open a chicken farm. He knew absolutely nothing about chicken farming, and if he'd done his research properly, he would have found there was already 3 other chicken farms in that area. Now, I've heard it reported that Elsie put the thought in his mind, but I doubt that, because the way Elsie was, I don't think she would have wanted her Norman out of her sights down in Sussex and only see him at weekends. But the relationship must still have been going well, because after working all the hours God sends, building sheds for the chickens, on a Friday evening Norman would jump onto his bicycle and ride the 50 miles to his parents' house in Kensal Green, London, meet up with Elsie a couple of times, then cycle back on a Sunday evening. That lad must have been fit. In the end, though, the work and the travelling took its toll, and with Norman needing to work at the weekends, now it was Elsie's turn to do the travelling by train down to Crowborough. Now, I presume Norman used to cycle rather than take the train to save money. When Elsie came to stay, she lodged in the evenings with a local couple, Mr. and Mrs. Cosham, as Elsie would not sleep with Norman before marriage, and besides, the hut where Norman beheaded and plucked his chickens was no place for a lady to sleep. So Elsie spent her days trying to tidy the hut up as best she could and watching Norman working, and then back to the Coshams in the evenings. Even then, things still seemed to be working out between Elsie and Norman, so much so that at Christmas 1922 the pair became engaged. But soon after, when Elsie lost her job, and not being able to hold on to any other job after that, and the chicken farm struggling to make any money, the cracks began to show. Even though Norman realised they didn't have any money to get married and told her so, Elsie wouldn't hear of it and was hell-bent on having her wedding, and she wanted it soon. In her eyes, the little wooden hut was no longer a squalid small wooden shack, but was now transformed into the cottage in the woods from Hansel and Gretel, and how wonderful their life would be there when married. Even Elsie's parents were getting panicky about Norman getting cold feet. They really wanted her off their hands. They agreed with her at all times just for a quiet life, and her father told Norman it's really better off for everyone if you just go along with anything she says. And if you could possibly marry her before her siblings get married, that really would work out well for everyone. Now, there is no doubt about it, Elsie had big mental health problems, and in this day and age it would be diagnosed and treated accordingly, but in the 1920s she would have thought to have been crazy. Family and work colleagues knew this, but it seems Norman was late to the party. But that in no way means she should be murdered or cut up or her body buried in a chicken run. Nobody deserves that. But Norman was getting sick of Elsie and the constant demands to get married. He was working 7 days a week and not breaking even, and his unemployable fiancée was reclining on a chaise lounge in London, being waited on hand and foot by her parents, dreaming of her wedding day. He now started to make excuses for her not to visit because of the cold, etc. And it was during one of these absences that Norman ventured into the village to the local dance. Here he met the beautiful, flirty, warm and understanding Bessie Caldecott. Things got serious between Norman and Bessie very quickly, but now he had a problem. Well, two really. How to tell Elsie and how to stop them bumping into each other before he got up the nerve to tell her. Now Elsie wasn't stupid, and she must have realised something was going on, so relaxed her no sex policy a bit, and a little bit of sexy play was introduced to the chicken hut. But unfortunately for Elsie, it was too late. Norman's senses had been awoken to the delights of Bessie Caldecott. After Elsie arrived home from her October visit to the chicken farm, depressed and agitated that once again Norman had refused to set the date for the wedding, she wrote to him telling him she was pregnant and he must marry her before Christmas. Norman, understandably, was a bit confused, so he wrote back telling her he didn't believe her as they had never actually gone the whole way, to which Elsie replied, and it would seem she had read up on it somewhere, that she had become pregnant through their heavy petting. To be honest, Norman had absolutely no idea if this was possible or not, but he had doubts. So he decided to tell her he had met someone else who had been visiting him late at night and who he had fallen in love with and planned to marry. Elsie was having none of it and wrote back telling him, "Nonsense. I will not release you from your promise to marry me. I am pregnant with your child and we will marry before Christmas." She berated him for his deception, but forgave him and still loved him. Norman decided that if he didn't open her letters and just ignored them, she would eventually get the message and leave him alone to pursue his happy ever after with Bessie. Now that's a big mistake. You would think after 4 years with Elsie, he would know this would never happen. And of course, it didn't. Because on the 5th of December, Elsie packed a few items in a small suitcase. Bizarrely, no change of clothes for her, but a cardigan for a baby, and caught the train to Crowborough, unannounced. On the 10th of December, a worried Mr. Cameron sent a telegram to Norman asking after his daughter. Norman replied by telegram that she had not been at the farm and to open letters. Mr. Cameron opened 2 letters that had recently arrived for Elsie from Norman, which said, "Where did you get to yesterday? You did not turn up. Where are you?" The Cameron suspicions were aroused and they contacted the police. The local police went to the farm to question Norman. He said he hadn't seen Elsie the day she supposedly set off for the chicken farm. She just didn't arrive. And they went away having no reason to disbelieve him and accepting his explanation that Elsie was emotional and unstable and anything could have happened to her. Even though the police had received 2 statements from a pair of flower growers, they had seen Elsie walking towards the Wesley chicken farm around 5:15 p.m. on the 5th of December. Then, in early January, a neighbour of Norman's, Mrs. Annie Price, came forward to say she had seen Elsie entering the farm on the day she vanished. Now, quite what this woman had been doing for a month while all this searching was going on outside her house was going on, we don't know, but better late than never, eh? The local police decided to call in Scotland Yard, and Inspector Gillan duly arrived, reviewed the evidence and wasted no time arresting Norman Thorne at his farm on the 14th of January 1925 and taking him into Crowborough police station for questioning. While this was happening, The hut was searched, and inside an old OXO tin was found Elsie's broken spectacles, her watch, a bracelet and some jewellery. The police then started digging at the farm, and early the next morning they unearthed the small suitcase. Norman was informed of the find and told he may be charged with murder. He then told the detectives he didn't kill Elsie, but he knew where she was buried. He then related the story I told you at the beginning of this episode. When Gillen asked why he, after finding Elsie hanging and cutting her down, he didn't just go for help rather than cutting her up, burying her and her things and burning the rope, then sending letters making people believe she had never arrived at the farm, he replied he didn't think he would be believed. Next day, following the directions Norman had given them, the police found Elsie's head, legs and other parts of her body buried under the chicken run. And consequently, Norman was charged with Elsie's murder. So the facts are, Elsie did indeed visit the farm that weekend, and Norman did definitely cut her up and bury her. But did he murder her? Yes, he did, said the eminent pathologist of the time, Sir Bernard Spilsbury. He had found several bruises on Elsie's face, and he believed she had been beaten and left, and she had died of shock. He also found no rope marks on the neck. No, he didn't, said the pathologist for the defence, Dr. Robert Bronte. Dr. Bronte argued that he found rope marks on Elsie's neck. But unfortunately, Dr. Bronte did not have the celebrity clout of Sir Bernard. At one time, just the appearance of the man would persuade the jury of the guilty verdict. But in recent times, Sir Bernard's star has become very tarnished, and it is thought many innocent men and women may have been wrongly executed on his evidence. But back to the evidence. A sack was filled with sand to the same weight as Elsie and hung from the soft pine beam by a rope the same as the clothesline that Norman burnt, and the rope cut into the beam. No cut marks were found in the beam after Elsie had supposedly hung from it. Now, I believe that that is good evidence and points to Norman's guilt. Dr. Bronte argued that he believed Elsie just wanted to scare Norman, stood on the chair waiting with the noose around her neck until she heard him coming through the door, and then stepped off the chair knowing that Norman would cut her down. Or would he? That's a chilling thought, isn't it? Someone just watching you as you slowly strangled to death. Anyway, away from my own very weird and macabre imagination and back to the evidence. Dr. Bronte believed Elsie had a vagal or carotid reflex which killed Elsie instantly before Norman could cut her down. And that's why there was no cut in the beam. She didn't hang there long enough. Unfortunately, the jury didn't believe it. And on the 16th of March 1925 at the Lewis Assizes, he was found guilty of murdering Elsie Cameron. And after all appeals failed, Norman was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on April the 22nd, 1925, ironically, the day of Elsie's 27th birthday. So what do you think of that? I'm not sure. A part of me wants to believe he was innocent, but the cutting her up and burying her doesn't make sense, and the beam having no cut mark in it is big evidence for me. People were queuing up to testify what an unpleasant person Elsie was, but she was definitely mentally ill and needed help and medication, and she in no way deserved to be murdered and cut up like this. It turned out at the autopsy that, of course, she wasn't pregnant. And why a small suitcase with just some personal items and a baby's cardigan, not even a change of underwear? Also, people who knew Elsie said there is no way she would have hanged herself while almost naked. The way she was, she would never have allowed herself to be found like that. Afterwards, public feeling was very uneasy about the verdict, and one famous resident of Crowborough, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame, was very vociferous on his feelings about Norman's innocence. A couple of years ago, a relative of Norman's was on the BBC TV programme Murder, Mystery and My Family. Now, this is a programme where two top barristers, one for the defence, one for the prosecution, review the evidence and the trial of an old case to see if they think it was a safe verdict. They then pass on their findings to a retired Crown Court judge who makes a decision on those findings. On Norman's case, both barristers felt the case was unsafe, but not the judge. He found the verdict safe, which was strange. I'd never heard him disagree with them before. Anyway, if you would like to email me with your opinion, I will leave the address in the description box. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please, could you give it a thumbs up and maybe subscribe and ding the little bell for further notifications of other crimes and other episodes. Anyway, that would be fantastic. I hope you enjoyed the story, and if you did, I'll see you next time. Take care.